Hi, I'm Michael. Welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we are talking about Parasite, the 2019 film written by Bong-Joon and Jin Won Han, directed by Bong-Joon. I'm here with the Lessons from Screenplay team, Trisha Arand.
Hello, everyone.
Brian Bittner.
Hello, hello.
And Alex Calleros.
Hi.
Now, when I say I'm here with the team, I mean that figuratively because we are recording remotely today. And also just want to give a heads up that we're probably going to butcher some names, but we're going to try hard not to, but you'll have to forgive us when we inevitably do. So Parasite is a movie that became this sensation. I just remember seeing it on Twitter, people saying, oh, this movie Parasite, it's so good, you should go see it. And then more and more people, and then it spiraling out of control and then winning Best Picture at the Oscars, which was super exciting. My experience of hearing about it was just that, hearing people say, this is so great, you got to go see it, conversations about it, but I saw no trailers. I had no idea what it was about. It seemed like kind of a horror movie-ish.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I didn't know anything about it. And so I went into the theater completely cold and was just swept away in this crazy, bonkers, awesome, amazing film. I'm curious for you guys, did you know what it was about? Had you seen trailers for it before it came out?
So I knew what it was about. I'd read about Parasite, but I had purposely avoided trailers because it sounded really good. I'd loved the director's previous two films, Okja and Snowpiercer. So I was already down. So I didn't need the trailer to know that I wanted to go see it. And I did know it was about class, and it was very relevant to our times. That was all the reviews were talking about that. So I knew kind of what to expect as far as it being a parable and being an allegory for income inequality and all these issues. But in the classical Bong Joon-ho way, it just got bonkers by the end. And I walked out of the theater being a little disoriented, like, wow, what did I just go through? And I think it wasn't until the second viewing that I really fell in love with it, because I knew what it was and I got so much more depth out of every part of it. And part of what we talked about in our video about symbols and motifs, we can get into that, but it just is such a rich movie on so many levels. It rewards multiple viewings, which is always my favorite movies reward multiple viewings. So yeah, I love it.
Now, so I have a question. So I did not get to see this in theaters. For those of you that saw it in theaters, is there like an audible response in the middle of the movie when it takes that horrifying turn? Was that true for you, Alex?
I think there was definitely like nervous laughter in the theater of like, what is happening now? What? And definitely in the end, in the finale with some of the,
oh my God. Yeah.
the crazy bloodbath, there was a lot of reaction.
Yeah. Because I watched this in my living room, and I, have a very low tolerance for horror movies. And so I was like, and I kind of had seen, I tried not to see too much about it, but I was nervous going into it, where I was like, I have the feeling this is gonna get scary at a certain point. So I was honestly just like on the edge of my seat the whole time, because I was expecting something scary to happen like around every corner almost. But nothing really prepares you for what exactly does happen. And that tracking shot that goes down the staircase and just goes and goes and goes. It's just so insane. And it's like one of the maybe the greatest midpoint in a movie ever.
Yeah.
It's so
I really
good.
want to talk about midpoints at some point, because this one it's great. Yeah.
It's incredible. I don't know. What was your experience, Bri?
So unlike Alex, I did not like Snowpiercer. I think it was one of the first movies one of the only movies in the past 5 or so years where when the credits rolled, I sort of breathed a sigh of relief that I didn't have to be watching it anymore. And that was partially just because of how over the top he is as a filmmaker. And I also haven't seen his other movies, so I don't have anything to compare it to. But I initially was like, okay, it's the guy who made Snowpiercer. And when I saw like trailers for Okja, I was like, I don't know if this is my kind of movie either. But then, of course, as you said, Michael, just like word of mouth was like Parasite. And I also kind of felt it was like horror-y kind of thing. I was like, oh, it's the guy who made like The Host and stuff. And then, I had seen some like I don't even know if I'd probably seen full trailers, but just all the ads you see and everything. So I had a good sense of like the style and the subject matter of the movie. But I went in fairly cold and just had a blast watching it. And I think the only downside was every time the movie did get, like in the first half, even whenever the movie got a little showy and sort of cinematic, I was like, Snowpiercer. Like I just had that, like, it's like weird to watch a movie by a filmmaker that you already have previous thoughts about, like watching a Tarantino movie or something. So I had just like a little bit of uh restraints on, kind of, but I still really loved it, and it was one of my favorite movies of the year. And then rewatching it again was just a blast, because now I knew, like, once you know where the movie goes, the fact that it is sort of a little big in the beginning makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask also, because this is my first Bong Joon-ho movie, so I had heard the name and knew that he had done these other films, kind of, but I didn't have that with me when I was sitting down in the theater, so I really just had no idea what to expect. And I think the first half of the movie is, it's like a comedy in some ways, but it still has this like tension, like the directing I felt was just really, really confident. And I think the moment that I knew I was in good hands with the filmmaking is really early on, when there's that one shot where the family is trying to convince the woman from the pizza place that like Kiwoo should come, the son should come and like be one of the workers. And it's just done in this one shot. It just pushes in, and it's just him talking to her at first. And then the sister comes and the mom, and they're all kind of crowding the frame and like pressuring her. And the staging of the guy in the background, I was just like, oh, there's a really simple, uninteresting way to do the scene that would be fine and convey everything, but this is being done in a very intentional way. And so there was this tension between, like, this feels like, the satire, dark comedy kind of thing, but it's being told in kind of a horror film way that just really like captured me and made it just a really, really fun watch. And then, it all explodes at that midpoint.
It's a similar thing I had said about like Moonlight or Roma, where it's like they're telling a very simple story, but in this big cinematic way. And those movies do it as part of their style. Parasite does it because it is going to turn into a movie where that makes sense as a style. But it's interesting how your brain sort of separates the story that you are seeing, the very literal story you're being told, and the way you're being told that story. And you sort of go into like almost fight or flight mode if it feels horror-y, or you go into like real tense mode, something like the diner scene in Moonlight, where you're just like the entire time like waiting for something to happen. Like, and some people complain nothing happens, but like I love it because it's just like I've never been so on the edge of my seat, just like watching people chat, basically small talk.
I was going to say that it also kind of reminds me of Get Out, and the idea that Jordan Peele always talked about Get Out being a social thriller. And this feels very much in the same genre of taking kind of an uncomfortable issue, and an issue that we don't want to really talk about or deal with too directly in polite society, but that really needs to be aired out, and airing it out through the form of both comedy, but also like extreme tension and horror thriller elements.
Well, I think this has a lot in common with us. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
to me
definitely.
would like, I had done this deep dive into.
It's literally like a top and bottom
I mean,
family.
it's that classic. We see that kind of like drawing room, like upstairs, downstairs kind of drama, a lot in terms of when we're wrestling with class, that actual like making social stratification into literal stratification as it, in terms of like levels of above the earth and under the earth. And we see this in film language all the time, right? You see a billionaire, or like even somebody like Tony Stark, right? He lives at the top of a tower, right? And then you have the poor people sort of, or like the middle class that live in like the middle level, and then you have people who live like all the way down below in basements or other subterranean areas like they do in Us. And so I think that I had just done a deep dive into Us for a Wisecrack video. First of all, very scary to watch, and I really struggled with sitting through that movie, to Jordan Peele's credit, because it really did scare me. But also, it wrestles with so many of the same themes, right? And we can get into this more, but just like all the mirroring that's going on in both of those movies of how these are two, like, these people are mirrors of each other. They are clones of each other, right? And there's not that much difference actually. So like the actual makeup of the Park family being the two parents, a boy and a girl, like sort of perfect cookie cutter little family. It's the same demographic, like same makeup in the Kim family.
Mhm.
And then of course you have the former housekeeper who's living then and her husband who are living then underneath. But yeah, it's interesting that so many movies about this same thing, you know, kind of came out all at once. And so to me, it's no shock that like Parasite was able to like cut in, like touch that nerve, but also because of what it is, it's so effective.
Yeah, it was something Bong-Joon-ho said in an interview. He said, like, look, you have Get Out and you have Us and you have Burning and you have this movie. He's like, it's not a coincidence. We're not all copying off each other. It's not a coincidence that filmmakers all over the world have a very similar thing to say at a same point in time. Um, but another, going back to Kurosawa again, sorry guys, but I saw High and Low last year, and Bong Joon-ho said that was absolutely a huge inspiration for him for Parasite. It takes place in this mansion on a hill, basically, and this wealthy patriarch. And then a child gets kidnapped, and there's a criminal, basically, who you realize he lives in the slums, which is way down the hill, and he has to look up every day out his window at this gorgeous house. And then those two characters basically mirror each other and play with each other, and it's a very similar sort of class statement. And awesome movie, by the way. Check it out.
Nice.
It's also interesting that the way that these movies are kind of being marketed is always in the horror genre. And this is something that came up because I was talking to my mother about this.
Mhm.
And she had heard people were saying Parasite and she wanted to see it, but she was like afraid it was going to be too scary. And it was kind of like the same thing that had happened with Get Out, where I knew a lot of people that wanted to see it, but they were like, oh, is it too scary? Because some people are turned off by horror films.
Mhm.
We don't know any. There aren't any on this podcast, but some people, that is the case. And
I
then
saw
they
Get
see
Out.
the movie. Right. Well, and so Get Out is not scary. Like I think there's many different tiers to horror films, and they're pretty
Sure.
accessible, safe, more like suspense thrillers in some ways. Us is much more obviously a horror film.
But Get Out's also more of a horror film than Parasite is, for instance.
Oh, definitely.
Right. Yeah. But so it's just interesting, and you know, from people I've talked to in the industry, it's clear that it's basically the only movies people go and see right now are superhero films and horror films. Like those are the movies that actually make money.
Yeah.
So whether or not you want it to be marketed as a horror film, that's what they have to do to get people into the seats, which is an interesting thing. But it is, you know, at the midpoint of Parasite, it does spin and become this whole other half of the story, and even the timeline is different. Like the first half, you know, that's weeks or whatever, maybe days, of the Kim family infiltrating this rich family, and then from midpoint to the ending, it's like 24, 36 hours. Like it all happens really quickly.
Right.
And that was just one of the many things that struck me about the change that happens in the midpoint. And I'm kind of like a midpoint like
Nerd.
junkie. Like it just yeah. A midpoint nerd.
As far as the midpoint goes, like watching it again recently, after that reveal, the tension is so high for such a long period of time. Like you get kind of a little bit of a respite when they go home to the flooded house, and that's just kind of a different mood. But
Mhm.
man, as soon as the parks turn around and start heading home because it's raining at the campsite, like everything is screwed. It's the make it worse rule of thumb. Like everything that could possibly goes wrong so quickly, and so like so many dominoes fall so fast.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable filmmaking. And yeah,
Yeah, I also love that for how much the movie shifts in the middle, because you have movies like From Dusk Till Dawn, which just literally turn into a different movie halfway through, or like, you know,
I
it's
love
just
that
like
movie. I'm sorry. I love it.
I love the first act, and then I'm like, oh, I want to see this like Tarantino movie, and then I'm like, what is happening? But I feel like Parasite's a great example of a movie that uses the midpoint to throw this total twist and wrench in the works, but it absolutely makes sense. Like, it's just like, okay, here is, now that we've gotten to this point in the story, what happens next? And what happens next is unexpected, but it all flows from everything we've been to up until this point.
Yeah, and I think the reason that is so effective, when I've watched it now I think 3 times, but, like, when you watch it again, you see the breadcrumbs that have been left for you the whole time about what's
Right.
gonna happen, because
Yeah. She eats
the
enough for
house.
two.
Yeah, exactly. All of those little things. Because we understand that the housekeeper's character is so important, but it's hard for us to understand why. Like, she really is the only, I mean, we meet the driver very briefly. Like, we know that Min was the other tutor, but it's like, this is the person that is the hardest person to wrench out of this place. She's very embedded in the situation. And so, like, she's the only one of the people that they end up replacing that is an actual character. And so when she exits the movie, we know she's not gone, right? There's something there where we're like, she's not gone.
I remember specifically in the theater, like that shot of the housekeeper leaving, and it's in the rain, and it kind of lingers on her like just a little bit longer, so you know, like something is happening here that's more than just goodbye from the movie, but it's like right in that perfect zone where you don't know what, and it doesn't hang a lantern on it too much.
Yeah.
Well, it could also be read as just you're supposed to feel bad for her because now you're not sure that you're on the Kim's side anymore, which I think that it's something the first time
Definitely.
as we were talking about the movie, I was like, oh yeah, they're kind of bad people or whatever. But rewatching it, it was like, oh no, things do sort of escalate where Kiwoo's like, no, I'm going to take this job, but like, I'm going to go to college and blah, blah, blah. And then the daughter is like, yeah, like I'll kind of maybe grift my way in, and then they're literally like getting people fired and sending to the hospital in order to install themselves into this house. So it's like as the movie goes on, you become less and less sort of morally aligned with these characters, but in a way that you're with them enough at the beginning that you're like, well, I'm along for the ride now. One little tease that I really liked, I noticed the second time, was when Ki-jung or Jessica, when she asks about did something happen in the first grade, in the background you can see the lights go off in the basement. So it's like right after they come up from the basement, and then the housekeeper walks away, and then the lights go off, and like it's like seems so obvious when you watch the movie, like on multiple viewings, but the first time, no way I would have noticed it.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that shot of the housekeeper leaving after being fired. It is that amazing thing where the first time you watch the movie, I didn't think twice about it. I thought, oh, this is here to make us empathize with this poor housekeeper. We now understand the Kims have kind of gotten corrupted in their quest to replace everybody. And on the second viewing, it was like, oh no, this is clearly a shot about the fact that she's leaving her husband in the basement, and what is she going to do? And she has to figure out what to do now. So just, yeah, I love when movies pull that off. It's like the first viewing, there's a way to interpret it. On the second viewing, it equally makes sense with the new understanding.
Hello, listener. Michael here, and this episode of Beyond the Screenplay is sponsored by Skillshare. As someone who's been fortunate enough to be able to work from home for several years, I've become very familiar with its benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, it's great to be able to work in your pajamas and be flexible with your hours, but at the same time, you're surrounded by a lot of distractions. I mean, home is where I keep all my video games. So for me, it was important to designate certain spaces as work-only zones, develop a morning routine, and set specific work hours. But everyone works differently, and workflows evolve, so I'm always on the lookout for new resources on how to make the most of your work time. For example, I recently found a class on Skillshare called Simple Productivity: How to Accomplish More with Less by Greg McKeown. In the class, Greg talks about how to decide what's most important to you and how to say no to non-essential commitments. He provides day-to-day tips for running an essentialist life and ways to hold yourself accountable for the long term. It was exactly this kind of thing that helped me become more productive in life, working smarter rather than simply harder, and maintaining control over all the things on your plate. You can check out Greg's class, as well as the other thousands of classes that Skillshare has on writing, photography, design, and more at Skillshare.com/beyondthescreenplay. The first 500 listeners to use our link will get 2 free months of Skillshare Premium membership. Explore your creativity at Skillshare.com/beyondthescreenplay and get 2 free months of premium membership. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring Beyond the Screenplay.
Well, it's interesting. The first half of this almost has like a heist movie vibe to it a little bit.
Yes,
where
absolutely.
like they have, and this is kind of going back to what you were saying, Brian, where it's like you're along for the ride because you want to see them actually pull it off, because we don't know the plan, we don't know how they're going to pull it off. There's that interesting voiceover where Ki Jung is talking about like, well, she's deathly allergic to peaches and and she's kind of explaining, like giving hints of the plan, and then it cuts to that wonderful scene where she's coaching her dad through like how to give the story about the active TB, and it's just like we're seeing the plan, but we're also seeing it unfold, but we want to see it work out. So even like though it's morally sort of ambiguous or even reprehensible, we kind of want to see them pull it off because it's just the fun of getting to watch them do it.
It's absolutely fun. I mean, the way that sequence has the climax where he does the final touch of the like hot sauce.
So
and
good.
Yeah. And the look on his face when he turns from the trash can.
Yeah. Oh, it's so.
Well, yeah. I feel like going off of what you were saying, Trisha, I think one of the triumphs of this movie is that it is morally complex.
Yeah.
Like, I think as soon as you start to feel comfortable with your relationship with the Kims and what they're doing, something happens to make it, to kind of undercut that or create this counterpoint where, you know, you see them at the beginning and they have this life of poverty. This is awful. And there's this opportunity. There's a little bit of dishonesty in it, but it seems like maybe it's a win-win situation. And then once Ki-woo brings in his sister, it's like, okay, well, we're kind of getting manipulative, but we've seen that she is skilled in her craft. So like, again, maybe this is still, and then as they start bringing in their parents and like actively sabotaging people, is you start to be like, well, feels a little bit less, but that's also when, like you were just saying, Alex, like the filmmaking gets fun. So it's like, you don't want this to be happening, but you also really do want it to be happening because it's so much fun. I think it's just so interesting. You know, when I walked out of the theater, to go back to the midpoint, my first thought was like, the structural design of this movie is so interesting, and I feel like it follows this path that most movies don't, where, you know, the midpoint is just such a midpoint, and it's a midpoint where
he's the midpoint guy, everybody.
You know what I mean? But like, it's such a clear false victory where it's like they have won, they have the house, they've gotten everything they wanted, and the movie is even like meta, and you know, she's screaming and then like lightning and thunder happens. Like, there's so much happening that's signaling like, okay, this is all about to go downhill, but you don't know how like it's going to go downhill. And so it's an interesting just way that arc plays out. And I was talking to a friend who said he was really into the movie and liked the movie, but the second half and especially the ending didn't play for him. And that he felt like he kind of lost his empathetic connection to him. And
Sure.
And we were talking, and I feel like part of that is just the structure and nature of this kind of tragic disillusionment story, where it's the second half isn't fun. It's a fall from grace.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was almost exhausting to watch it the second time just because it is such a journey. And we've talked about, like, we talked about in Minority Report. I think we talked about in another podcast where, like, movies that don't just feel like that was a fun way to spend 90 minutes, movies that feel like you are going somewhere and like it's going to take you on this absolute ride. I also love, it's sort of like does both things that midpoints usually do. Like John York talks about the midpoint being like where the protagonist gets the elixir so they can, you know, make it out of the forest. So we did a video on Collateral about that. But also like Before Sunset, it's like, oh, the midpoint is where like bad things happen and like where a wrench gets thrown in the works, you know. And Parasite's a great example of both those things happen. Like they get everything they ever wanted, and then literally 5 minutes later it's like and now part 2, then they get threatened to text point, which I love.
Oh yeah, that is brilliant. I thought the way they used the send button is like a rocket launcher. It's
yeah
it's so awesome. Well, Going back to what you were saying, Bri, that scene with them in the, after right before they discover that people are in the basement, that scene where they're in the house and they've just like basically taken it over. We see Ki Jung in the bathtub and they're like, drinking their water and they're taking a nap in the beautiful sunlight in the living room. And Ki Woo is out on the lawn just reading and looking into the blue sky. And it is the most quintessential, like they have the thing they want. And I love that the tagline, I think it was on the British poster that I saw this, the tagline that they put was "Act like you own the place," which is exactly like what this movie is.
Right.
That's great.
But then the scene where they're all drinking, where the Kims are all together and they're drinking and they're talking about the parks. And I think that scene is so critical for a number of reasons. It gets at a lot of the thematic stuff, which we can get into about the movie, but it also like it helps us kind of reconcile ourselves with what it is that they're doing. So they even touch on that where she's like, we had to get that chauffeur fired, and it's like, well, he probably found a better job. He's young, he's talented, like he probably is somewhere better now. So they're talking about that and sort of making their own moral sense of it, right?
Right.
But then also they're talking about the parks, and they clearly don't bear any ill will toward the parks, really. Like it's so interesting because that scene is mirrored, it really is only minutes later when the Kims are then hiding under the coffee table and the parks are talking about them, right? And so like
Right.
when we hear the parks talk about them, the parks are mean kind of, or they're just like, oh, poor people, gross. But when the Kims are talking about the parks, they actually kind of look up to them and they think they're like nice basically and good people, and that
There's a whole conversation about being nice. When you're
exactly.
rich, you can afford to be nice. It smooths over all the rough edges. Having money.
They are pretty critical of how like gullible they are, though, and, because especially
Sure.
like the age old thing is, if you want to have your protagonist be a bad person, then just make sure the antagonist is even worse. And like I think that it's an interesting thing with Mrs. Park because she's not a bad person, but because she's so gullible, you almost get this like sixth sense of satisfaction of like seeing her be kind of grifted by this family, where you're like, if you're going to be that much of an idiot, then fine, I don't care. And that's horrible. Like it almost like makes you as the viewer feel like you're morally questionable. But I do love how convincing the kids are, as both the tutor and the art teacher, by just being so confident and intense about everything.
Right.
They're just like, no, you can't be in the room. And, I think if you look at this symbol here, and just like, it just shows like, no matter what you do, as long as you really act like you know what the hell you're talking about, everyone will believe you.
Yeah.
I love when she's like, that corner is the schizophrenia zone. Like,
yeah.
So brilliant.
It's so good. And I love going back again to the scene where they're, acting like they own the place. That was another moment where I was struck by the filmmaking and the confidence of the filmmaking, where there are these shots that are like kind of oneers, like it's on Ki Jung as she's on the couch drinking, and then it'll dolly over and then rack to Ki Woo right as he says his line, and it feels organic, but it's also so smooth and precise that it must be planned. And there was just a lot of really interesting filmmaking happening that was not showy at all, but was really interesting to pay attention to.
And I read that that Bong-Joon Ho didn't actually do that much traditional coverage, where it wasn't like he did a wide, and then like a shot, reverse shot or whatever. I read that he just storyboarded, in a very Hitchcock sort of way, exactly what he wanted it to be. And that was what they shot. And so in order to like edit, they would use different takes of stuff, but they kind of didn't have like a lot of options, which
like multiple angles.
Yeah, which, respect. I can't imagine doing that myself. That's such confident filmmaking, but it's exactly what you're saying. He's conveying what he wants within the corners of the frame, and of course, letting the performances and the script, which is amazing, speak for itself.
Just in general, the cinematography, the lighting, the pacing, the music, like this movie just feels so clean and crisp, and like everything about it is so purposeful and like beautifully executed.
They built those sets.
Mm-hmm.
They built them.
That was in Real House?
No.
I think the
They
top
just-
Can
floor
they build it for me?
isn't even
They
real.
built it. No, the top floor isn't even real. Like,
It's CG.
It's amazing. It's so that house is so incredible. And like, it's so you just believe it. I just believed it. They were like, this was designed by this famous architect and he lived here and da da da. I was like, I'm sure that is that's like a Frank Lloyd Wright house in the United States. You know, it's like, I'm sure that it is like a very well-known architect and it's like a famous house in Korea, 100%. And of course it's not. And they did it because they thought we're thinking about, like, I was reading that they actually, the production designers and Bong-Joon and everything were like, came up with a story for who the architect is and like what he would have been prioritizing and like the way that the light would fall on the lot. And so like he definitely, again, wanted to convey. So you have all these wide horizontal spaces and these like wide windows and vistas that like look outside instead of vertical space and all of this stuff. So they kind of just, I mean, it's just amazing. And the entire street that the Kims live on is a set as well. The whole street, because they flooded it. Like,
Right.
it's
Right.
incredible.
Yeah, and Bong Joon-ho talked about how the design of that house had to like make sense for who could be like spying on people at different times and all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
basically, like they had to design the house as they were designing the story, which is incredible.
It's so cool.
Well, and part of what was really cool about it also as, you know, a dumb American was getting to see another culture and like different, you know, stratospheres of social class and et cetera, and how that is manifest in Korea. Like, I feel like that's one of the things I loved about Roma also, is that it painted this like full portrait of what Mexico is like,
Or was
and-
then, because
and
that's a period
was
movie.
like-
or was
yeah.
then. Right, yeah. But I feel like we have such a narrow view of so many of these places that I feel like that was one of the extra bonus candy things that came along with this movie. Not just that it was well made, but you're also getting exposure to something that most people don't get to see. There's obviously a lot of foreign films that you can check out.
I would encourage everybody listening, because I could talk about what I've read, but I'm sure I would mess it up. But I would really encourage everybody to read more about what's going on in Korea, and in terms of the frustration of young people who are out of work, and like the military culture and like all kinds of stuff. Like there's a lot of interesting stuff that this is very specifically commenting on, and it does have a lot of resonance with American viewers because some of it rings very like sort of similarly to what we have. You know, we talk about like Gen Z and millennials and like our anxieties and fears and things like that. So Kiwoo is essentially of our generation, right? And so we're going through kind of similar things, but obviously in dramatically different cultures. But I would really encourage people to read a lot more about that, because this movie definitely opens a door into it, but obviously doesn't say everything that there is to say. So yeah, definitely look up more about that. I've like only sort of scratched the surface of what this is engaging with specifically in Korean culture. But then of course it's saying something international as well.
One thing I was going to say too is that there's a lot of interesting references, usually between the parks, towards America, about like, oh, this tent is safe in the rain. It was made in the U.S. and kind of like how a lot of their culture of wealth was imported from the West. You know,
Well,
I
it's
think that was
colonialism.
yeah, it was very interesting
Yeah.
tension in the movie as well. Of like, there's this some South Korean like authenticity almost in like the food and all these elements, but then there's a very Western sheen to the way the wealthy are living, and that was just very interesting to see. And also some of like a lot of the jokes and things they talked about were dealing with their anxiety about North Korea. There was a lot of, you know, when they were talking about the missile launcher on the send button of their cell phone, it's like, you know, I'm Kim Jong-un, I'm going to launch the missile. I loved all those different. It's interesting to see all that from that perspective. So yeah.
What I thought you were going to say, Alex, was going back to what makes it have international appeal, which is all of the like just these things that are transcendent, right? Like motifs and symbols, which we can get into a little bit if you want to.
Another thing that is interesting in the movie is this kind of worship of the wealthy. And, when they go down to the basement and they meet a man who's been living there for who knows how long, he has almost like a shrine to Mr. Park on his wall, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
he's trying to send Morse code messages to Mr. Park, who he kind of is thanking, gratefully for like allowing him to live here, or making his life possible. And I think that's a really interesting cultural critique, of a
Of
culture where
course.
people are living in pretty dire conditions and yet are voting for, worshiping in their own kind of way, this culture of wealth that they're probably never going to have access to. And
Mhm.
I think that it's obviously, it speaks universally. It's kind of a global moment we're in right now.
I really like that, like Trisha, you talked about a scene that sort of like really speaks to the theme and everything. And one line I didn't pick up on before was when they are talking to the couple in the basement, and the husband says like, "Yeah, I had to use loan sharks because we had no choice." And the wife says like, "No, I always, make sure to only take things out of my own pay or my own portions," and it's that kind of thing. Like you do get the sense that they did start from this sort of more wholesome place, and they've kind of gotten to this crazy desperate place, and that's sort of the same arc you follow the Kims on, which is they,
Mhm.
like I said before, they do start in a place where you're like, okay, like I guess you're maybe like milking the system a little, but like your intentions are, and you see how quickly they're like, oh no, now we're so corrupted that when we see someone who basically looks like we looked a week ago, we're not going to help them, even though they're maybe coming from a more uh, morally justified place than we are. Like we don't have time for these people, kind of thing. And it's just like there's so much going on.
That's part of the critique as well, is the way that, I think, my interpretation of the movie is the way that the system is set up, is that it's such a ruthless system, a kind of like every man for himself, winner takes all sort of economy, that when you do kind of cheat or whatever your way up to a position of some power, then you're going to hold on to that at all costs. There's not a class solidarity with other people who are in need,
Right.
who are now below
Mhm.
you. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
So since we're kind of talking about theme, as you know, we all saw Parasite and we were talking about different things we wanted to discuss. Trisha, you brought up this idea of looking at symbols and motifs and kind of pointed out to me, who's someone that doesn't automatically read symbols and motifs when watching a film, the way that those can support the theme, and as Alex, you've said multiple times, helps make the thematic statements be able to travel across cultures because it isn't language based, kind of a thing. So yeah, Trisha, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, and I just want to return, this actually all does tie together. I want to return to what you guys were saying, Alex and Brian, just a minute ago, which is just about, I think one of the things that actually doesn't connect as well is that we as Americans tend to think of ourselves as individuals. And so when we see individuals in film, we tend to um like isolate them and just sort of like look at them like, well, look at what that person is doing. They're doing something like immoral or dishonest. And like that's an individual choice that that person is making. But not everybody has to make that choice, kind of thing. That's very, very Western, that mindset of thinking as individuals. I think one of the reasons that this movie is very successful across cultures is that because although Kiwoo is the protagonist, really the entire Kim family is the protagonist. They're all on the same journey.
It's like a shared protagonist.
Yes. And I think that helps us read their actions. Like, there's no one person in the Kim family that's like, why would you cheat this person? Why would you lie about this thing? They're all on the same page. And that helps us in our Western brains extend the boundaries of who we see these people to be. And that brings this movie onto more of the plane that we've discussed many times on this podcast of a parable or a fable. The Kims are not
Hmm.
meant to be read as individuals, and it helps that there are four of them instead of just one. That helps us see that they're not meant to be read as individuals any more than the Parks are meant to be read as individuals. These are representations of entire classes and entire cultures and systems. And
Yeah.
so I think that's part of why this was able to, more than maybe some of Bong Joon-ho's other films, or films from other places around the world, where again we are like, well, that person is doing a thing I don't understand or agree with, and that's an individual thing that they're choosing to do. But this movie sort of helps
Right.
us see the bigger picture a little bit.
Yeah, it's like if you watch a movie where a society is operating a certain way, you aren't necessarily going like, "Oh, I don't know if I agree with this choice," because it's not a choice, it's a world that the movie is showing you, as opposed to
Right.
if a character does something. So having a family be sort of a shared protagonist is kind of a way of like almost bridging that gap where you're like, well, they collectively make these choices and they collectively do this thing. So I guess that's just the way it's like a mini society of 4 people in a weird kind of way. But I kind of get what you're saying there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, just returning back to some of the amazing like filmmaking techniques here, and almost literary techniques here. Just wanting to spend some time talking about like motifs and how, I mean, I already touched earlier on like the upstairs downstairs, kind of how the levels themselves are imagery, right, that we can concretely point to and say like the Parks live up there, the Kims live here in the middle, right, which is the first shot of the movie,
Mhm.
that basement row of windows, and then we have people who live all the way down at the lowest level. So that's one thing, and leaning into that.
It's basically Snowpiercer, but if the train went up.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly
right.
right. And extrapolating from that are all of the images of light in here, right? Where they're specifically mentioned like, oh, the light is so beautiful in the Parks house, right? Like they have access to light as though that's a thing that only the wealthy are allowed to have. And then of course we have like light signaling from the basement where like he uses
Mhm.
light to try to reach right upward into that space, which is a really cool idea, and using Morse code, which again is very cool. But and then food, which it's really interesting that Chung Suk ends up cooking that ramdan is not a traditional Korean dish. It's like a weird mashup of cultures. It's like
Mhm.
ramen plus udon, right? Is the idea behind it. And that's why when they're like, "Can you make ramdan?" She's like, "What is that?"
Right.
Um because it's again, it's this mashup of cultures. It's a symbol of again the like cultures clashing, but also like access to all kinds of culture, right? Art, music, all these things that the Parks have access to that the Kims don't have access to, that kind of thing. And meanwhile, we see the Kims like eating in this chauffeur's cafeteria, right? This like driver's cafeteria where they're just like filling their plates with whatever it is, or worse, eating whatever it is that they're eating at the
Moldy
beginning of the
bread.
Dog
movie.
food and the moldy bread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something so disgusting. So
Stink
the
bugs.
theme here is being, yeah, the theme is reinforced concretely in these motifs over and over again.
Well, and one thing, the kind of last act of the movie this time, watching it, really got under my skin because you feel this like creeping like tension and also kind of a depression after their basement is flooded. And
Yes.
you have the contrast of the cheery mother, Mrs. Park, going to throw an impromptu birthday party. She goes to her big closet with all of her like fancy clothes, and it cuts to the storm shelter. People are like fighting each other for like, I don't know, secondhand
Yeah.
clothing. And then you see the father, Kitek, and he's driving her around, bagging her groceries, and you can just sense this like horrible, kind of sickening feeling of she's not even aware of his emotion or his energy, or that something's very wrong with him right now. She's just completely ignoring him as a person.
Yeah, she's on the phone the entire time. She's not even speaking to him at all. She's just
Mhm.
taking his presence for granted. That scene where she like is riding in the car and riding in the car and chatting on the phone, and she like ultimately rolls the window down. She has her feet up. Like she has her shoes off. She has her
Yep.
feet up on the back of the seat, just like that automatic of like, well, I don't smell. Like
And he's not complaining about the smell. I'm sure there
right,
is
exactly. But you're absolutely right that this sense of foreboding, like he's gonna crack, right? You can see it where he
Right.
after that speech where he talks about how not to make plans, right? Like The only plan that doesn't fail is no
Which
plan.
is so good. I love that. Like, it's like the most sad possible monologue you could have, basically, of like, why even try? Like, it's better to not try.
And the other really uncomfortable moment is when he's dressing him up, when Mr. Park is dressing him up in the like Indian headdress, and it's like, listen, I know it's goofy, but this is part of your pay. Like, this is part of your job.
Right.
You're getting paid more for this. Okay, so be
it's
happy.
Just like, it's like the humiliation and like the power that is being wielded of, well, we have the money, we're paying you, so you're going to do whatever we want you to do, and you're not really a person. So it's, yeah.
I will say that I think the third act is the place that I feel is least perfect. Is the critique I'm going to make. I feel like for me, that's where like, I think everything up to that point, I buy, and I'm with the motivations and the pace at which the motivations happen. I think the third act, things kind of accelerate a little bit quickly for me. That was my experience in the theater anyway, where it was like, just the day before, they were excited that they were getting paid and getting to do all this stuff for the parks. Like, obviously, what happens to them is awful. Like the movie sets it up such that I can't really fault it, but just my experience of it was, it seemed to go a little bit fast for me from, this is great, we're finally getting everything we ever wanted, to now I'm so upset and offended, I'm going to murder this man.
I will say, the moment that Kai-Tak, the father, murders Mr. Park, the first time I saw it, I didn't quite buy that the smell issue was enough to trigger that. I now appreciate it on a more meta level because we've investigated this motif of smell, and I like it for that reason now. But I think that, and also just kind of the Bong-Joon Ho-ness of the conclusion of, like, literally the like resolution is that he's now going to live forever in the basement, felt a little bit goofy also. But once again, on the more motif, symbolic, thematic level, I like it. So it's that tricky line where, like, a lot of the movie works on the surface and doesn't require you to be reading it as purely symbolic, but some of the stuff in the third act does really enter the true parable allegory land.
Yeah, definitely. I think on one side you do have the fact that he's like trying to help his dying daughter, and Mr. Park is like, hey, come on, buddy, let's go, like, get the keys. So know, you get the sense that he is primed to. But yeah, I read it more as where we are in kind of parable land now, where, like, he doesn't literally kill him because he pinched his nose. That's not the point. The point is everything we've seen up until that part.
I think one of the things that helps the viewer, because I agree with you that if you're still so grounded in the movie that you don't realize it's veered into like parable metaphor land, then the denouement is so insane and so shocking. Like, it's obviously not realistic in any way. Like, there would never be people trapped in the basement is thing number one. And, and if there were, they're not going to be like murderous, psychopaths, probably. Although there definitely have been stories of crazy people living in people's attics and basements. So
they may not have been before they got
that part
in the basement.
That part kind of did make sense to me. The man living in the basement becoming a murderous rampager, that part worked.
Sure.
I think the thing that helps the audience make the leap into like metaphor land, though, are some of the other like very, very outrageous images in here. So it's what you were saying, Alex, about like the Native American headdress, and it's like he's got this, teepee in the backyard, and the bright sun, and the giant cake, and like all of this stuff. It kind of like pushes those symbols a little bit further, so it almost feels like Alice in Wonderlandy, right? Where at that midpoint we're like, we're through the looking glass now,
right.
And like everything starts to get big and weird and weirder and progressively weirder, because at that point we kind of buy like, okay, the Parks don't realize who the Kims are when they're infiltrating, but once after that happens and they, the mom just kicks Moon Guang down the stairs.
I love that moment.
Oh, that is another one of those theater reaction moments. That was definitely a big groan.
Hey, my theater of just me and my girlfriend, we both like vocally were like, ah.
Right. Ditto. I don't know if it was the full theater, but it was definitely
Right.
The
me.
crunch.
And-
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like the comedy of movement is when you take too much or too little effort to do something. And so the fact that she does too little to then have that dire consequence pushes you, I think, into that surreal space.
Well, the party itself at the end too, I think is pretty surreal. Like there's like the lady singing,
Yeah.
with a cellist, and it goes into the
Exactly.
absurd. And they're
Yes.
chopping wood for some reason and wearing polos. Yeah. I think it's fantastic, but there's something about that party that feels almost obscene in its like
Yeah.
pastel perfectness.
Yes, definitely.
So the Lord of the Rings movies came out when I was in high school, and they were an obsession of mine and kind of changed who I was as a filmmaker. I want to talk about the different cuts. I personally think they should make a master cut with the best of the theatrical and extended, because I have problems with both.
Is there a cut without Orlando Bloom?
What's wrong with Orlando Bloom?
He's an elf. Elves are cool. I'd be an elf.
Anyway, if you want to hear us talk more about Lord of the Rings, we are actually going to be doing a 3-part series for the podcast when we reach 500 patrons on Patreon. So if you want that to happen, go ahead and go to patreon.com, find Beyond the Screenplay, and support us. We will also be doing a Patreon exclusive episode about the Hobbit trilogy, which is going to be interesting. We hope to see you on Patreon. Just a couple bucks a month really helps support the channel and keeps us going.
Subscribe, you fools.
Brian.
Awesome. Why don't we go around and quickly say what lessons we're going to take from Parasite? Brian, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Mine's really about escalation. I just really appreciated it with this movie, watching it the second time, especially like knowing where everything was going and sort of tracking each little beat change in the movie. Because a lot of movies you're following different characters in different locations and stuff. This is it's very linear, but you're sort of, both the intensity and the pacing are just speeding up and speeding up. So you have Kiwoo infiltrating, and it's this very slow and methodical process, and it's all interesting. But then you switch over to Ki Jung, and then she is like also kind of slow and methodical, but it gets there a little more quickly. And then the two parents is sort of like bang bang, like we just kind of get there, and then you have this midpoint. And then, as you said, Michael, like just the actual time of the chronological time of the movie, it goes from being several days to being just like 24 to 36 hours, and everything, because then you have the parks come back home, and then the party, and then the finale. It's like everything just keeps building, and again, both in pacing and intensity. So you just never feel like there's a moment where you just get to relax. It's just you're always going on this building ride, and I think that's really, really cool and really impressive. It doesn't have the, that sort of thing where like the end of the second act of every movie, you're just kind of going like, all right, I kind of know what the next 40 minutes are going to be, so we just have to let it happen. Like you don't get that in Parasite, and I love that.
Yeah, even the moments where it does slow down, there's still this tension, and because of the momentum that you were talking about, you feel confident that there is a trajectory, which I always appreciate in movies, where it's like, this movie is going somewhere. I may not know where it's going, but it knows, and it's on its way.
I just want to shout out all of the amazing character design in this. And I feel like I talk about character design a lot, but in this case, what I really appreciate is the character very, very careful differentiation, because as we talked about, the Kims necessarily need to function as almost one protagonist in this story, but they also can't be exactly one person, right? They all have to sort of like fit together and have a dynamic. And the dynamic that they have to have has to be in contrast to the Park family's dynamic. And so when we see the Park family interacting with each other, we're not necessarily supposed to infer anything about the Parks as individuals, rather about their family dynamic and their family, connection, or sort of how they function together. And that is drawn in juxtaposition with what's happening with the Kims as a family. But you still have to differentiate the characters. So I was thinking about like this, how, so the scenes, returning to the scenes that are almost back to back there in the living room that are right on either side of the midpoint, right? Where the scene where the Kims are talking to each other and the brother and sister are really close and they really care about each other. And the brother's talking about how much he believes, Kiwoo's like talking about how much he believes in Ki Jung, and she's sort of like the pride and the hope of the family. And meanwhile, the parents are like in conflict with each other, right? Where Chung Suk is saying like, yeah, your father is actually a coward and he would run away and hide and he doesn't deserve anything. And we kind of can see that lack of intimacy, or just this sort of old wound, I guess, in their marriage, immediately contrasted with when the Park family gets home. We see the two kids who don't like each other at all and don't care about each other go their separate ways. The little boy is a spoiled brat and he goes off to his room and doesn't say anything. And then we see actually the parents then end up having sex on the couch in the living room. So there's intimacy there. So both of those like brother, sister, and parent like relationships are in contrast with each other, but they also keep those individual scenes interesting. It is really clever, subtle, well-rendered character design. And I think if you set out to watch it again, you'll only see more and more of that. I think it's really, really well done.
Absolutely. And I feel like it helps you connect with
Yes.
all the characters like at different times too, where like the Park family, at times they're saying not nice things about poor people, but like other times you get a sense that there is like a connection there and there's a life and they are a family.
Well, and I just thought about this actually, going back to intimacy between the adults and their partnership, right? The only time we ever see any like sexual chemistry between the parents and the Kim family is after they're installed in the Park's house, right? Where like, where the mom is walking around and then like the, Kai-tak comes in and like, pinches her. And like, we see that kind of like having the financial tension off of their relationship enables them to be close to each other the same way that we see some of that intimacy between Mr. and Mrs. Park.
Right. It's in that same vein of like, if I was rich, I could afford to be nice.
If I was rich, I could afford to like be president of my marriage.
Right.
Basically.
Well, and the funny inverse of that is when the Parks are having sex on the couch, they're actually doing like a fantasy scene of being poor. It's like like she's like saying, I'm on drugs. I'm in the back of a car.
Buy me drugs.
Buy me drugs. Like we're gonna have sex in a dirty backseat of a car.
The fetishization, is that a word?
Yeah.
Fetishization, sure, of the poor, right? Or of circumstances that are dramatically different than yours.
Like that's what gets them off once they have the wealth.
Exactly.
I feel like that was a moment where it felt like the captions were maybe missing a little bit, like not doing the full justice of what was
probably.
I feel like I got it,
but you can read between the lines
for sure.
Yeah.
Buy me drugs.
Sure. Right. Alex, buy me drugs. I mean, what's your lesson?
We kind of talked about this before, but just this movie has such great setups and payoffs.
Yes.
It's such a well-designed movie in every way, and one of those setups and payoffs that's so perfect, it's kind of like a 1, 2, 3 structure, is first introducing the fact that the son had some kind of traumatic incident in the past, during like the art therapy intake session that comes up. And then midway through, we learned that he saw a ghost coming up through from the basement, and that gave him a seizure. And then it pays off in the party at the end, where it's like the whole reason all the dominoes fall in the party is because he sees the ghost from the basement in real life and has a seizure, and the dad needs to get the keys to bring him to the hospital. And so just there's so many satisfying, I think, dominoes falling is the best way to describe it. Just it was all put in place. Yeah.
The rock is there, and the plum extract, where she's like, oh, go to the basement and get some plum extract. And she goes down to that thing and to the big bookcase with all the jars on it. And like, it's so well designed with the setups and payoffs.
Yeah.
And that shot of him from the basement, where you were seeing it from the point of view as a little kid, that is
one of the best like horror images.
That would mess you up.
Yeah.
Right. And you simultaneously totally get it, but it's also terrifying.
Bong-Joon was like, we cast this guy with these amazing eyes, and we were like, well, let's do something with them. And then that's where they got the idea to have him rising. Yeah.
His eyes through the whole ending are terrifying as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's unsettling in general. Yeah, I think kind of like I was saying earlier, I was just so struck by the directing prowess that was like throughout this film. I think it tickled my like David Fincher zone a little bit, right? Where there's the clean precision and confidence in the filmmaking, but there was a looseness, like somehow there's this kind of almost improvisational feeling with some of the filmmaking choices, despite it clearly being intentional. Like they're choreographed moments and camera moves where it switches what side of the line things are being shot at key moments, or like floats between one character to another, like I was saying earlier, or even one of you were just mentioning when Kiwoo was first talking to the daughter in that tutoring session, that whole like scene is just one slow like push in. And I think what I'm impressed by is that it all feels effortless and organic, despite it clearly being very intentional and controlled. And that's something that I aspire to as a filmmaker. So this is definitely a movie that I'm going to go through and watch all over again, and like shot by shot, like map, okay, what is this doing? What is that doing? How did he know that? And like, why does this work? Because I just think the directing is really, really good.
I was taking notes during my second viewing, and I just kept saying, what? This is so good. The cinematography is superb. Best director, everything's good. It's just, perfect.
Right. Good work, Oscars. Well, why don't we say what we have been watching recently? Trisha, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I continued on my Jane Fonda kick. I've been talking to you guys about Jane Fonda, and I finally got around to watching They Shoot Horses, Don't They? From 1969. It's a Sidney Pollack movie with Jane Fonda, Susanna York, Michael Sarrazini, and Bruce Dern. And it is set during the Depression, and it's about these crazy dance marathons, like dance competitions that were all the rage during that time. So if you don't know, people used to have like weeks long dance competitions that Congress eventually had to pass a law against because people were dying.
Are you making this up?
I'm not. Read your history.
Are the horses dancing, or they're humans dancing?
Listen, it's a very bizarre title because it's based on a novel. The horses have really nothing to do with the entire movie. It is one of the best names for a movie ever, but this was actually happening. They were having these crazy dance marathons. It's basically the precursor of reality TV, where they would put a bunch of couples on the dance floor and they would be like, okay, you have to dance now for weeks and weeks. You get like 10-minute breaks. You get like half an hour.
What? This sounds like a Bong-Joon Ho movie.
But it's based on a thing that actually happened in history. Like,
what?
Anyway, so it's a weird film. It's an amazing exploration of one of the weirder things that's ever happened. But watching it feels so prescient because it's about like exploitation of people for like basically poor people, because everyone who enters the dance competition does it to win money because they desperately need it. It's the Depression. And Jane Fonda she's the main character, obviously, and she plays this really hard-boiled, sarcastic, cynical young woman who's just like, I need the money. I really don't care about anything else. I'm going to win it. But everyone in it is like desperate. Like Bruce Dern plays the husband of a woman who's pregnant the entire time. And it's this torturous thing. And so it is about the exploitation of people who are desperate for money, and it's so humiliating everything that they get put through in this competition, and it's claustrophobic and it's hard to watch. It's also kind of funny because the situation is absurd. Anyway, great film. If you're into movies from the late 60s or Jane Fonda or Bruce Dern, I mean, honestly, or dance competitions, then check it out.
Then Trisha has the movie for you.
I mean,
check.
It obviously checks all of my boxes because it's a female-led historical thing, and it's kind of off the wall and awesome. So
awesome. Cool. Brian?
I have been watching Jane Fonda's Abs, Buns, and Thighs from 1995.
Stop it!
No, I watched the High Fidelity series on Hulu, starring Zoe Kravitz. And Jake Lacey, which if you watch The Office all the way until the end and then watched for 5 more seasons, he shows up as Pete, one of the 2 guys who shows up in the last couple seasons for no reason. And I was really curious about the High Fidelity, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, being a series. I thought it was really weird that Lisa Bonet's daughter is the star and not just playing Marie DeSalle's daughter or playing Marie DeSalle or something. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, it's just about a person named Rob who owns a record store. It's just like the movie, but a series. So, or at least it starts out that way. So when I saw the trailer in the first few episodes, I thought, like, okay, I know all the jokes that are coming. Like, I get it. And then finally, around the middle, it starts to take off and become its own thing. It finds its own voice, and it'll take like one scene from the movie and do a whole episode kind of exploring that concept or that idea of that scene. Zoe Kravitz is fantastic. Like, even from the first episode, I was like, okay, a different person in this role. I don't know how I'd feel, but with her, I'm just like really compelled by her. And then the two co-workers, her two employees, the Jack Black and Todd Luizzo parallels of the show, they also, both of them in the first episode or two, I was like, I don't know, these characters are a little weird. And then by the end, I was just totally in love with them, and the show gives them a little time to breathe and be their own people and everything. So yeah, I was really happy with it by the end.
There's no chance Michael has seen High Fidelity.
I've seen the trailers for it.
Yeah.
I remember those on the VHS back in the day. But that's an interesting concept. Yeah, turning a movie into a series.
Like they're doing Parasite.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They are.
Wait, what?
Is it for HBO?
Yeah, for HBO.
Wow.
In theory, to star Mark Ruffalo and Tilda Swinton. Yep.
And Bong-Joon-ho.
Yeah, it is Bong-Joon.
Really?
I thought he was part of it.
Yeah.
It's an HBO limited series.
Right, but instead of being a remake, it's Bong Joon-ho he had so many ideas for the movie, which you can see in the movie because it feels like there's so much jam-packed into it, that he wanted to tell a longer version of it that would still feel interesting to new viewers, but also feel, for people who like the movie, it's not going to feel like you're just watching the same thing over again, which was part of what I didn't like about High Fidelity in the first couple episodes.
It is, in theory, and I quote, going to explore stories that happen in between the sequences in the film.
All right. Well, we'll stay tuned to check that out.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting concept. Okay. Alex, what have you been watching?
I watched the season 3 premiere of Westworld on HBO. Westworld's an interesting show. I have had a very mixed relationship with it the last 2 seasons. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, and if there's ever a show given a good budget on a network like HBO that is sci-fi, I want to like it, and I want it to be good, and I want to be into it. But man, Westworld really tested my patience the last couple seasons. And part of it is just, there's Jonathan Nolan is one of the lead writers of it, co-creators of it, and he's got the thing that his brother has. It's the Nolan thing where I both really like some of the mystery box over cleverness, but then you can stretch that out way too far to the point where, like, what is even the story anymore? Like, is there a story here, or is this just about how much you can rearrange the order of time to confuse me as much as possible? Anyway, I was basically kind of done with Westworld, but then I saw the trailers for season 3, and I was interested again because it's basically now outside of the park. They're out of the park. It's now in the universe where this robot park exists. And now it's actually doing the reverse. It's like hitting all my buttons. It's doing design fiction the way that Minority Report did. There's a dearth of movies and TV shows that take place in a near future that do this kind of design fiction. So I give a show or a movie a lot of credit when they really attempt to, at least. And I think this first episode shows a lot of promise of, we're kind of rebooting the show, leaving the park behind. We're introducing some new characters. We're introducing a whole world that I'm much more interested to explore than the Western theme park world. And so I'm excited to see if they can maintain this through the whole season. I hope they don't try to out clever themselves. I hope they just stick with good characters and good story, and be clever, do the twisty thing, but like tell a good story in the meantime as you build to that twisty thing. So far, so good. I'm only 1 episode in, but I am quite pleased so far with this season.
Nice.
Alt Shift X has a great kind of tear down of Westworld season 2.
It's like a rant,
It's very
basically.
cathartic.
Yeah. In his wonderful Alt Shift X voice, which is
Just,
great.
I recommend that. I should have watched that. I'm curious to see where it keeps going. I have been rewatching 30 Rock.
So good.
which it's just one of my favorite shows of all time because it's just so good and so clever. And there are so many things to talk about it. Like anytime I rewatch a show, I'm just like, yeah, it's good. Go watch it again. And I just love the meta jokes. Like it's clearly a show written for people that have some knowledge of how shows are made and what like writing is about, because there's like rule of three jokes and just like jokes on jokes where they like set up a joke and instead of making that joke, they make a joke on the joke that you thought they were going to make. Like I love that so much. But it's also been interesting because it was a pretty political show and it's 12, 14 years old now, something like that. And so it's also been interesting seeing them deal with topics in a way that, wouldn't fly anymore. Like I think it's still in the gray zone of the line, but like race and gender and equality and all these things they touch on, I feel like you'd have to do it differently today, which has also made me think about comedy in general. And I think that's, a lot of comedians have complained that people, woke culture and like people are too sensitive because they don't laugh when we're racist anymore. And just that the comedy, I feel like can be a way to reveal the truth of a moment and like to have us interface with that in a way that makes us laugh. And so part of me is wondering if just necessarily certain kinds of comedy aren't going to age well because the truth of that moment evolves. So I've been watching, I've been laughing, I've been thinking, I've been very much enjoying myself rewatching
Liz Lemon.
Nice.
What a journey.
So great.
Lemon.
Great. That
Agreed.
show's amazing.
I just want to quote everything Tracy Jordan says. Have some self-respect, bird. Don't you know what you can fly? Like live every week like it's Shark Week. I'm going to prove that I can finish what I... And then he doesn't say start. It's just genius. Anyway.
I always think back to me in 2007, 8 when 30 Rock started, which was the same time that Studio 60 started.
Yeah.
Which are both like basically the exact same premise, very different shows, obviously. And I was like, oh yeah, which show is gonna succeed? The one with like the lady from Saturday Night Live or the one by Aaron Sorkin? Like, yeah, that's a tough one. And of course, Studio 60 went nowhere, and 30 Rock became amazing. Like, I think it was also like a show I watched the first couple episodes when they came out, and I was like, yeah, it's fine. And then like when I then went back in after it had been like maybe done and watched the whole thing, I was like, okay, genius.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk more about 30 Rock at some point because there's just like 18,000 things to say.
Yeah.
Maybe do an episode about 30 Rock.
Or 18,000 episodes even. Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been our conversation about Parasite. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to the patrons that support this show and make it possible. Hit us up on Twitter. We want to know what you think about Parasite or any other random thoughts you have. We always love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.